Hi there.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Friday on EB-5 Investors' first webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about what makes a good EB-5 project. And today, I'm happy to have Irina Rostova and Shay Armstrong with me. Irina's background as both an immigration attorney and a FINRA rep gives her some very unique perspective on this space. And Shay's background in corporate and securities and real estate really helps us speak clearly about how we're structuring these EB-5 projects. I myself am the co-founder and CEO of Green Card Fund, a regional center that's been doing this business for about 14 years. But with that, I'll hand it over to each of the panelists to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Irina.
Thank you, Kyle. Hi, everyone. My name is Irina Rostova. I practiced immigration law for about 10 years, and now I switched to being a full-time FINRA rep. So my job is to help investors look at different projects and help them pick the most suitable option. And I founded a platform called EB-5 Support, which provides mentoring for immigration attorneys and project selection services for investors. And I'm happy to be part of the Invest America team, which is the brokerage with which I'm registered.
Yeah, hi, I'm Shay Armstrong. I am a partner with Bradley Arendt. We're a 700-person law firm, and I'm based in Dallas, Texas. I've been in the crazy world of EB-5 since about 2008, and we've seen many changes. And I started the first half of my career in-house on the sponsor side as a sponsor representative, and then now I'm on the professional services side.
Wonderful. With that, look, we've got the chat open. We want to make this interactive. You'll see we're going to be going back and forth with one another, asking each other's questions as we flow through this. We've also tried to make this not overly dry and focusing on some of the kind of hot topics that we see today, whether that's related to the new sustainment guidance and what that means from project structuring or rural versus urban. So we do have the chat open. We're going to take those in, try to answer them as we go through the presentation, but also we'll keep some time at the end to go through Q&A. So with that, one of the first topics as we were outlining this, we were talking a bit about project industries and both commercial real estate and also operating business. A lot of times in EB-5, because it is dominated by commercial real estate, that does take lead. But this was the first area we were going to focus in on. Irina, you want to start?
Well, sure. One of the things that I think we discussed when we were preparing for this webinar is that picking a project is, sometimes as serious as kind of picking your partner for life. It's almost like a marriage. So when we look at different projects, we look at what are the red flags and what are the green flags. And I think that's going to be our theme today. When investors or attorneys or their advisors are looking at projects, what are some red and green flags? Kyle, do you want to tell us about the different industries? Like, do you have a preference of whether it's real estate or not? Or should investors consider different types of industries? What about film production or oil and gas? What do you consider to be a red flag, a green flag, and why?
Yeah, look, I think later in this presentation, we're going to talk about the team, right? You want people to be experts in the industry they're investing in, right? So I really start there. After that, and this is, focused on the investment side, I think there are times we have to look through the immigration lens and the investment lens. Sometimes those are aligned, sometimes they're in conflict. But from the investment side, my focus is always on what's the underlying collateral, or, if you're in operating businesses, what type of credit enhancements, what type of corporate guarantees, what type of balance sheet support are there to create viable pathways to repayment. So I think, given that, when we start to look at some things like film production or oil and gas, right? I mean, when you look at these ventures, they can spend money, right? We know that can happen. What happens after they spend money, and what is collateral or support to repayment if the drilling or the filming doesn't go well? There can be some questions there. I'm not a film expert. I'm not an oil and gas expert. So, I'm not going to speak to that a whole lot, right? Our background is in commercial real estate, and specifically within commercial real estate hospitality. I think when we look among the commercial real estate industries, each market cycle is going to present different opportunities, right? Obviously, I think in the news a lot right now is, how challenged office is. The key there, I think, is, again, looking back to the collateral, what's the pathway to repayment? And, if you were in an office deal at the right basis, at the right price point compared to where that investment is, maybe that makes sense, right? But this is where, as an investor, as an advisor, as somebody involved in this and trying to select a project, look at the third-party reports, validate the market, understand that collateral well, and where is that EB-5 investment and its security in relation to that collateral or those credit enhancements.
So what you're saying is look for the asset that's going to secure your investment once the money is spent. And Shay, I know that you structure a lot of these deals. Do you find that there's any particular industry that's safer, or is that why we end up with a lot of projects being in the real estate, because there's an asset at the end of the expenditures?
Yeah, I think commercial real estate works best for EB-5 simply because from a very macro level, simply because it's a predictable project, right? There's real data available. There's a real bricks and mortar asset available. There's a real objective exit strategy available, unlike possible a tech play or the unpredictability of a mining or natural gas play. And so, the first thing I look at, forget EB-5 for a second. If you're a venture capitalist or a passive investor or a family office, the first thing you're going to look at, who's the principal? What's their background? Maybe you're not hot about hotels, but I think we've all, I have clients that have been incredibly successful building hotels, and they know that really well. And so that becomes predictive in nature, and that's a risk management tactic where I know that there's a good chance, because they've done it 50 other times, they built middle level serviced hotels, that these guys are going to repeat. And so I think you look at the principal, and then you go to the property type, and then you become more granular in your due diligence, to Kyle's point, and look at what the collateral is, the loan docs, what's the offering, and then that's where the really detailed due diligence begins.
Okay.
So transitioning maybe from the industry, location is always a big piece of real estate. And I think we'll kind of focus to the real estate side, just given that truly does dominate the EB-5 space. These days, rural is top of mind for so many people. Obviously, the new RIA passed in 2022 created set-asides. We're now starting to see USCIS processing move to this language of priority processing, which was not defined well in the statutes, but now we're starting to get the stories to come in that, yes, in fact, that is moving faster. But as we do look at that, Shay, I think this is a good opportunity to turn to you. EB-5 had been dominated historically, pre-RIA, by urban deals, right? Urban high unemployment deals. And I think underwriting an urban high unemployment deal looks a little different than underwriting a rural deal. Can you speak to that a little bit, and how you understand risk in a rural location maybe in a different way than in an urban location?
Yeah, there is this massive push right now for rural projects because of this set aside and the idea of expedited processing for rural investments or rural TEAs. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages, and it's not a one size fits all, just like in urban for rural projects. of course, it's the factors are scale, market, property type. Okay, being on the extreme side here and being ridiculous, I don't think I want to invest into a Ritz-Carlton in Stephenville, Texas. No offense against Stephenville, Texas, but there's just not much of demand, right? So what is the demand? Now, rural, a lot of times the pluses on the rural side is that the local municipality and the local jurisdiction they seem to be more supportive of the projects because there's just simply less projects in their locale, as opposed to New York, where you may have hundreds of projects going on at one time. So the entitlement process might be easier. Now, these deals might be cleaner too. Most rural deals, in my opinion, are a little cleaner because they're smaller, right? There's less involvement. The capital stack's less complex. But the negatives, and Kyle brought this up in our preparation meeting, which I think was a great point. If you overbuild in a rural area, once again, what's the exit strategy in repaying your investors? There's less capital solutions or refinancing solutions when it's time to exit.
Yeah, and we have a question in the chat. If the visa bulletin shows that the visa category is not current, can the investor do a concurrent filing? And I think that pertains, to investors who are looking at rural deals in order to be able to take advantage of the concurrent adjustment of status. You can. So, well, there are two visa bulletin calendars. There's one for NVC processing, and then there's another one for the adjustment of status. And so that's the one you want to look at to see if you're eligible to file a concurrent adjustment. So sometimes we do have the regular visa bulletin showing a backlog, but the way the USAS and the DHS do their calculations, they know that the concurrent filing and the processing will take some time. So if they believe your visa is going to be available in the near future, they do allow you to file a concurrent adjustment. So you just have to look at that second calendar for the adjustments. But, from the investor standpoint, I think that's why a lot of investors right now are going into rural, as well as still those who can do a concurrent adjustment, they can take advantage of the TEA as well.
So Irina, you're making a very important point there, and I want to make sure that everybody catches it. So when you said the regular visa bulletin, are you talking about the final action date visa bulletin and then that second one? Just for terminology, as people are looking those up, I know just as a matter of days ago, AIIA got some of their FOIA data back, right? And a lot of people are doing analysis and looking at that, and they're looking at those waiting lines based off of that final action date visa bulletin. Is that correct? And then just draw that distinction to the second one you're referencing for concurrent filing.
Yes, absolutely. So I will, the first one, it's labeled with an A when you look at the visa bulletin page. And that's the final action one. And that's important to understand the overall current status. So if you have an approval today and you're trying to process a visa, that calendar will tell you whether there are visa categories available for your particular country. And that's final action dates, calendar A. And calendar B, which is dates for filing of employment-based visa applications. And that is the calendar that lets you know if you can do a concurrent filing, essentially together with your application at this moment. So thank you, Kyle, for asking me to clarify that.
Hey, I'm not a lawyer over here, so it took me a little bit of time to understand that distinction. So.
And I would just say, make sure you are working with your immigration attorney to explain to you exactly what you can and cannot do and how that calendar moves. Okay.
Great. Thanks for that question there. Coming back to the rural considerations, Shay, I think you made an important point here on, most of the commercial real estate EB-5 deals are looking at refinance or sale as an exit strategy. So when we're in these rural locations, and especially when you're in rural locations in today's economic environment where, commercial real estate lending capital isn't as readily available as it usually is. you have to look at, what are the pathways to take out EB-5, right? Doing several $100 million of financing in a rural location, that's atypical, right? That's not something that happens on a regular basis. A lot of commercial real estate and the lending within it for banks is really dominated by regional banks, right? And so for a regional bank to take on loans of that size, it's difficult, right? And so if you start to limit kind of the traditional bank lending sources as an option, it can reduce predictability, create a little bit of volatility to that pathway to exit. So I think that's a very important point there. Also, when we think about the scale of the project, right? If these things get too large, demand in rural locations can be difficult, right? And necessarily the local population isn't enough usually to sustain the demand for that property, so people have to come in. So, what do those tourist volumes look like? What do that kind of transient demand look like, and can it support projects of that scale?
And Kyle, just to add to that, I would say for your more operationally related property types, your hotels, hospitality, retail, where's the staffing going to come from, right? There's just less options, which staffing could be a challenge. And obviously that's going to be integral to the success of the whole project.
Yeah. And Shay, I think that staffing point is two-sided, right? Both on the development side and the operations side, right? And so if you have issues with labor on the construction side, that can result in cost and time overruns. And obviously operationally, it impacts costs and just delivering a high level of service if that's within the business model.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So from a perspective, I think from an investor's perspective, you should be looking at rural projects if that's the type of visa category you need to aim for, or the types of set-asides you need to aim for. However, that should not eliminate making sure that the project is a viable project. And for those countries who are not going to be affected by the retrogression, my advice to those investors has been, I understand that the rural projects are getting faster processing, but it's not necessarily worth it to save a few months of processing time if you're going to take on additional risks on the project side. So if you found an amazing rural project that is financially solid, it's one thing. But if you're leaning towards a less financially stable project for faster processing time, then I think that would be a bad decision.
And the question here, real quick, Irina, is, in a nutshell, are rural projects more risky than urban? And I think we all would agree it depends. And so it depends on some rural areas are more economically viable than other areas. Right now, I'm involved in a deal near Jackson Hole, Wyoming, with a real housing shortage, real demographic drivers. Okay, that's something that my principals underwrote. But I have seen some quirky ones out there that don't make sense. I think we've all seen that.
I think it comes down to evaluating demand. Is this a speculative project where we're going into a rural area because we want to try out a new concept? Or are we building something in a rural area because the demand is already there and there are no facilities?
Great point. Moving on, guys. Something we also focused on a lot in our conversation was the capital stack. Within EB-5, I think we've seen, everything from common equity to senior debt. And I know we were just talking about, even when the position is the same, even within senior debt, comparing different structures really has a big impact on safety. So maybe starting a little bit, Shay, one of the things we talked about was, were the covenants, right? And this is typically a place where you, as an attorney working with banks and others, you see these a lot. But can you speak a little bit to that? What you see in EB-5, what you see in kind of traditional credit, and alignment between those?
Yeah, and I think, first off, what we've seen loan docs for EB-5, whether it's subordinate or senior debt, become more and more skinny. And what I mean by that, they don't contain the basic provisions that you would have in a traditional construction loan, which they should. And these are basic, reps and warranties, such as, to environmental, to good standing and authority, to economic and non-economic covenants, traditional standard reporting requirements, both at the quarterly and annual level, and then economic thresholds like debt service coverage ratios needs to be maintained at a certain point. Standard default language with reasonable cure periods, of course. So that's just kind of a list of what you usually see in a traditional construction loan. And a lot of times when we're looking at certain deals, I don't see these types of protective provisions for both parties, but especially the lender within the documents.
Okay. What are, Kyle, what do you think are some of the green flags that we're seeing now? I mean, senior position or senior loans have become really popular. Do you believe that they give the advantage to investors that the market believes that they do, or are there still things we need to look out for when it's a senior loan?
Look, I think on its surface, being in a senior secured position has a lot of advantages, right? If there is a default, if something has to happen, you are in a lead position to get to that collateral and make your investors whole, right? I mean, we've seen it play out in some failed projects. I know there used to be this kind of concept in the market of, oh, I want to see a big lender or somebody else in front of EB-5. That makes the deal more safe. Well, in the instance of default, trust me, JP Morgan Chase did not underwrite the deal to make it safe for the subordinate lenders, right? In fact, they do a lot of things to tilt the table in their favor. And if the deal wobbles, they wipe out the subordinate creditors. So, I think senior positions have a lot of advantages, but not all senior debt is created the same. And so, you have Shay talking to the covenants within the loan documents and the assurances that are coming from a project sponsor within that, right? Construction completion guarantees, certain repayment assurances. How is that structured? I think the second piece, and what I'm increasingly seeing, is these large mixed use projects, EB-5 funding against the total project, but then just taking a senior position on a sliver of that project, right? So what becomes critical in this is, what is the size of your EB-5 investment, right? What is the size of the EB-5 senior loan in relation to that collateral value? Right. I mean, a lot of times they start to mix this a little bit and they say, well, EB-5 as a percentage of total project cost, but they don't talk about EB-5 as a percentage of collateral that they are getting through those loan documents. And so that starts to become a very important distinction as people try to underwrite and understand the safety of that deal. I think the other thing is, to really understand where the other sources of capital are coming from, right? Even as the senior lender, right? Typically, a senior lender is going to say, well, I need all the equity to be committed and in place before I start extending my dollars, right? If there's mezzanine debt included, if there's outside preferred equity, right? If there's subordinated debt, you've got to understand where the other pieces of the capital stack are coming and where your EB-5 dollars are being funded in that sequence. Right. I think you flip that on its head a little bit and say, okay, if EB-5 is preferred equity, right, where am I funding in the cycle of the deal? And are those other capital sources that are required to finish the project, are those truly committed? And Shay, I mean, I think this is a good point to go to you on what is the definition of a real commitment. But I know you work with banks and you see how banks might be able to wiggle out of some of these things that feel or look like a commitment.
Yeah, and it pains me to say, because I was not involved in structuring your deal, Kyle, but Kyle's deal is, I mean, it's ripe and ready to go with all the protective measures in place, with all the real commitments. So what is a commitment? It's a loan agreement. It's executed loan agreement, right? The rules of engagement have been signed by all parties. a lot of my deals at the 526 stage. And I don't think it's tragic. It's just kind of the cycle of real estate. We present term sheets and letters of intent, and those aren't binding, right? Those aren't binding, and it may not be the bank that my clients use for their senior debt. Kyle, I believe your project, you guys are like engaged with your actual senior debt today during the raise, and I believe you have bridge too, which is incredible. Engaged.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
That's thanks for the segue and the plug all at the same
Oh,
time.
I mean, I just crushed it. Yeah, you owe me a cocktail after this.
I do. I'm trying not to gloat here, but look, I think from an underwriting perspective, this is another important point. If EB-5 is senior debt, EB-5 takes time to fundraise, right? And so how is that project going to happen on a predictable schedule if it's 100% reliant on EB-5, for 60%, 70% of that total capital stack, right? And that's where having bridge lending in place really helps smooth that out, right? So the project's moving forward regardless of the EB-5 funding, and then that EB-5 funding's coming in and paying down that bridge. Now, look, back to a previous point we made here, today's capital markets in the U.S. aren't the same that they were, pre-RIA in some of these past projects. There were a lot of lenders out there engaged in kind of the bridge lending space. I think that's harder to find today, right? I mean, in our situation of our project, we have a very strong project sponsor that's using their own balance sheet, right, to provide that bridge financing because they didn't like the terms they were seeing, from the kind of public or the bank options that were out there. So all important points, right? When we're looking at this capital stack, how are we understanding the predictability of the project occurring, on schedule so that, all these kind of immigration gateways and hurdles can be hit? And I mean, Arena, this is a little ad lib. I know we didn't talk about it, but talking about timing of the project happening and some of the immigration considerations. Do you want to speak to that a little for a minute, and just some of the risks that can stem out of project delays?
Of course. No, that's one of the most important things that we look at when we're analyzing a project with prospective investors, the timeline of the construction, the financing, and their immigration timeline, because the investor has to be in and the jobs have to start being created by a certain period. Back in the days when we had very slow processing times, it did create an advantage for some projects that if they were delayed by a year or two from their expected construction timeline, by the time it was time to remove conditions and the green cards, they were able to catch up. With faster processing times, on one hand, that's amazing. We want faster processing times. We want our clients getting their initial green cards faster. But that also puts real pressure on the projects to perform in accordance with the timeline. If you're investing into a project, you filed your I-526, you have your approval in your initial green card within a year, that means at a 3-year mark, you have to file the I-9 form to remove conditions. If your project had a 2 or 3 year construction timeline and they got delayed by a year, by the time you're filing your I-9, all the jobs have not been created yet. And that can put your entire immigration process at risk. So the way we try to reduce that risk is we do look at projects that are practically ready. They either already broke ground and they're under construction, or they are already doing their preliminary construction work. So they are ready to begin construction. That's really important because historically it tends to be that most of the longer delays happen before you go vertical in construction, permit delays, financing delays, and so on. Once you're already building, that process generally moves forward pretty quickly. So that's one thing we look at with investors. And then another thing, coming back to the capital stack, bridge loans and what I call Plan B financing. So bridge loans are very important. what is the developer using for money to keep the construction going while the EB-5 raise is taking place? Because on one hand, we don't want to go into a project that's not ready to go under construction. On the other hand, how is the developer supposed to start construction when they haven't raised their EB-5 funds? So that's where a bridge loan comes in, and it's very important. A bridge loan is a temporary loan that the developer takes to begin the construction process. And then when EB-5 money comes in, it replaces that bridge loan. And then I also like to have a plan B. If it is a larger raise, so say we have a $200 million budget for the project, 100 of that is coming from EB-5 financing. What happens if the EB-5 money doesn't come in? Did this lender secure another loan, or does their bridge allow them to kind of finish the construction period? That's really important. And again, that's where, going back to Shay's point, what does securing another loan mean? We want to make sure it's not just a letter of intent, that there are loan agreements in place to make sure your process is moving forward.
And Rena, I was just going to add, I saw this yesterday on a capital stack, and then I saw it 2 years ago when I was helping with an EB-5 workout. And it's, if EB-5 is coming as a senior lender, that's awesome. Just make sure in those loan docs that the senior EB-5 lender can be subordinated in the event the EB-5 lender doesn't fully perform, and so the project isn't held hostage.
So that brings up a really great point, because it's kind of like it's both a risk and an advantage. Yeah. On one hand, you want to be in a senior position, but if all of the EB-5 money is not raised, and your loan agreements say that then the EB-5 money can move into the second position, and a senior loan can be they can take a senior loan out on the project. On one hand, it provides you the opportunity for the developer to secure that financing and finish the project. On the other hand, you really want to look at that loan agreement to make sure your position is not so subordinated that it puts you at an additional risk.
I see we have a question here, and I'm not sure if I fully understand it, but it says, if project principals utilize bridge equity financing, is that a red flag for EB-5 investors? Irina, Shay, do you guys have any response to that, or we might need some clarifying questions?
I may have an idea of what the question is, because I've seen some projects where the developer, for example, puts up 30% equity, but they're allowed to repay themselves 10% if their EB-5 raises a sufficient amount of money. It's not necessarily a red flag, but it is something to look at. How much equity can that developer repay? How much equity is still going to be left? So the fact that the developer doesn't need to secure bridge financing to start construction, they have their own money to do that, is great. But you do not want to be going into a project that says sponsors or developers' equity is 30%, but their loan documents allow to repay 20% back. Then the developer leaves very little skin in the game, and that puts the EB-5 investors at an additional risk.
Great point. Great point. Moving on here. Slide to move. So we were talking about timelines, and I think this is a good segue, Shay. What you mentioned, entitlements, right? All these things have kind of been wrapped around this term of shovel ready, but what is shovel ready? And I mean, Irina, I know you're talking a bit about the timing of when EB-5 investor capital comes in versus that risk. So we keep kind of swirling around it. Let's dive in a little further. What is shovel ready? When should EB-5 dollars come in this process? So Shay, I'll start with you, and then we'll move to Irina.
Yeah, it's everyone's got a little definition, a little different, varying definition of this. My definition is when the capital stack has been formalized and the entitlement process is finished, the local municipalities approve the project, and maybe even have your construction permit, and we're ready to push start around horizontally or build.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean,
entitlements, real quick. I mean, this is something I learned being abroad. We're in the US, we have fee simple ownership of land. That's not true everywhere. Sometimes if you're getting land from government, the way you're going to use it is just kind of handled in the process of being granted the right to use that land. So Shay, can you just speak real quickly? What are entitlements? What's the difference between kind of entitlements and permits in that process so people can draw some distinctions here?
Yeah, and I kind of include them all together. I mean, the whole entitlement process is the legal process in which the developer seeks government or approval for the development plans, right? So that includes zoning. I mean, we're talking about underwriting here, which is good. And this is a great point that we brought up because you should underwrite this, right? Is it zoned for commercial, whatever you're building? Number two is the permitting process, right? Is there at least an application on file? I hate to file 596F, the project filings, when there's actually not even a construction permit on file. And so, it's those processes that, you want to get through with the city, and I always go back and forth with my EB-5 immigration attorney friends. They're advocates for the investor, right? So they want to see, hey, are we like under construction here? And I'm like, no, we're not under construction. I'm a developer guy. I'm the advocate for the deal. We're 6 months away. So I think where's the sweet spot? And maybe this is like it's a good segue to Irina's answer. A lot of times these projects aren't going to be under construction. I do agree with my EB-5 immigration attorney friends that there is less risk when the project is under construction, because once you start going vertical, it's most likely you're going to continue vertically, or at the very least, you're going to get your green card, even if the project fails, because there's enough bricks and mortar to be imputed into job creation. Erin, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, obviously, the further along in the process, the better for investors, as long as investors are not coming in, as long as their capital was anticipated when the project was being structured. So we don't want to go into, for example, a completed project that had permanent financing and trying to replace that, because then you're risking not getting the green card. But obviously, the further along in construction, the better. It doesn't negate us looking at all these other factors. But I actually wanted to throw this kind of to Kyle as a regional center for you. When you're taking on the project and you're structuring the documents, how ready is ready? At which point would you not get involved yet? And at which point would you be comfortable going to market and raising for a project?
Yeah, look, we've been doing this for a long time, and I would say my answers sometimes differ between a project sponsor I've been working with for a long time and I understand how they move through these processes versus somebody I haven't worked with, right? The other point to be made here, and I'm not trying to overly complicate it, but where the project is being built really matters, right? You start talking about a coastal property in California that has to go through environmental impact reports and everything else versus friendlier states like, Montana or Arizona, for example, that have much lower bars, right? That also starts to impact how we look at these projects. But generally, I want to see that the site is controlled, right? It's owned, it's got the long-term lease, whatever it is, site is controlled. They've got the scope of the project worked out, right? So they aren't sitting here hemming and hawing, is this a 60-room hotel or is this a 200-room hotel, right? They've got a project plan locked down. They're in preliminary documents and they've engaged with the government, right? And so Shay gets into zoning, right? We want to see conforming use or non-conforming uses that have been approved, right? We want to see initial plans that have been signed off to, right? In some places, this will be called like a site development permit, right? And in that instance, when we've made it that far, I don't have as much of an issue if, for example, the grading and drainage permit isn't issued yet, right? That's a formality at that point because the project has already been approved. The zoning is lined up. They know what's happening, right? So again, not trying to overly complicate it. Each jurisdiction is different. You want to see a level of engagement with that jurisdiction, but at the base level, site control, zoning, engagement with those authorities that they need to engage with to get through those approvals. And then obviously we start to get into the permits as a matter of sequence, from, grading, drainage, site work to building.
Mhm. Absolutely. And then one more thing I think I would mention also, if it's of any type of specialty project, charter schools or another project that requires additional, let's just say, licensing or approvals, you want to make sure those are in place too, because can't really start construction if you haven't been able to get the other designations to operate that project in the future.
Yeah, it's a very, very good point, Irina. When you start to get into education, when you start to get into healthcare facilities and some of these other things, the licensing or approval process can be quite onerous. And sometimes in the instance of charter schools, there are fixed application windows. And if you miss that, well, the application window doesn't resume till next year, right? So again, so much of this comes back to understand the predictability of timing, because timing can really break an EB-5 investment and the immigration process.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe we've been a little down here, all focused on red flags. Let's talk about some of the positive indicators, or as you said, Irina, the green flags. What are you looking for that give you a big positive check mark as you're going through and evaluating a deal for your clients, both as a broker dealer and when you were an attorney?
Mm. A client asked me yesterday, what matters more to me, an experienced developer or an experienced regional center? And to me, that was a very easy answer. Experienced regional center. An experienced regional center will pick only experienced developers. And I have really almost never seen a situation where an experienced regional center is going to have some sort of a very serious delay on the project or even denials. Most experienced regional centers have a very solid track record. Chances of delays or issues with projects are minimal. And I have seen a ton of situations where you have a very experienced, a well-known developer, but they are new to the EB-5 space. And if they don't align themselves with a very experienced regional center, there are problems. Anything from they overestimate how quickly they can raise the EB-5 funds, to they overestimate how much they can raise, or they don't have the procedures in place to track all the documents that they need to provide to USCIS, or they're making material changes in the project along the way, disqualifying that project. So green flag, experienced regional center. So that's one of the things that I absolutely look for with my investors, is how long this regional center has been operating. I mean, Kyle, you've mentioned you guys have been operating for 14 years. You can't put a price on that level of expertise and what you have seen, so you can predict a lot of issues before they have the possibility of even materializing. So that's my biggest one. And then we look at the capital stack, lots of equity from the sponsor or anything over 20%, and kind of where the project is along in terms of their timeline and the developer experience. So those are my three big things.
So we're talking about teams here. Shay, I know you spoke about this. I mean, at the surface level, we all know there's a regional center in this thing. We've got attorneys around it. There's a project sponsor. Can you go a couple layers deeper here on who all is involved in a well-functioning EB-5 and project team, and some of those team members that you're looking for to understand risk and give you confidence?
Yeah, to get really granular on the project side, I always consider myself the EB-5 quarterback of the deal side. And then we bring in the specialists, the economists, impact data source, Baker Tilly, those guys and girls that do a wonderful job providing the economic specialty, which is, I mean, at the end of the day, that economic report is the heartbeat of this whole program, right? It's about job creation and economic impacts. So that's very important that you use a reputable, which there's maybe 4 or 5 of them, maybe 6 or 7 out there that you should be using for your economic reports. And then, of course, the regional center is really the lead partner, right, on the deal side. Whether it's a broker-lender relationship, whether it's a borrower-lender relationship, or whether it is simply an affiliation agreement, they're a significant partner for the reasons Irina noted. Also, there may be additional consultants, such as a business plan writer. On a lot of my deals, I'll do the business plan in-house, but a lot of times there are really well-pedigreed third-party business plan writers that are involved. And then just to add, kind of in the non-EB-5 world, what's a well-rounded development team? So let's go another level. Well, what's a well-rounded development team? And this is all about doing due diligence. A positive sign would be if you are able to look up the general contractor and the engineer and the architect and potentially a third-party operator or any other third-party consultants that are provided in the private placement memorandum or the business plan, and you look them up and they're a well-established business, right? And so that's also what you want to look at the next level, is the actual development team.
Wonderful. We see these questions coming in. We will get to them. We're just, for the sake of time, going to move through a few more of these slides, and then at the end, we'll circle back to these questions and make sure we respond to everybody if you can hang around a little longer for those.
But I wanted to throw out one question, like I wanted to hand select them so that they go with the topic of the slide, because one of the question asks is vertically integrated project preferred, meaning the developer and the regional center are the same entity, the same team, or do we prefer when it's 2 different teams? The developer and the regional center are different teams. Shay?
Yeah, I must have complicated myself out of this question because I have both. Now I'm on the spot. I think it depends. I mean, I do like to see what's great about having an independent regional center is it's separate, really distinct, non-conflicted oversight, right? Which is the intent of the regional center program. And so that is really nice to see. And that's their role, right? Is, everyone should have their own internal controls at the NCE level, at the JCE level. And the regional center is going to have this, but their own internal controls to abide by EB-5 policies and regulations and SEC policies and regulations. But I think it is nice to have an independent some oversight. God, Randy made me confess.
And Kyle, sorry to put you on the spot. And Kyle, for your preference, do you have a preference as a regional center of working with other developers, or do you see yourself, do you think both models would work for you, financing other developers' projects or having an integrated regional center, and why?
We strictly stay independent. I think, to Shay's point, we see a value in having our fiduciary duty to the investors, and ultimately, look, it all makes sense and looks good when the project goes to plan, right? But the moment there's a default, right? The moment things are not working out, it becomes really hard to impose default provisions or effectively negotiate those loan documents and those default terms when you're sitting on both sides of the table, right? And if we sit there and look at it and say, well, if I'm in that seat, well, if I'm the developer of the real estate, I have a bigger economic win if the enforcement over here from the credit side or the outside investment side is softer on me, right? And there's really there's no avoiding that, right? I mean, we obviously had a very, very large and spectacular failure in New York City around this. And you saw what one of the biggest and a sizable balance sheet that developer had, right? That, in some senses could have filled the hole. But they chose not to because they didn't have to, right? Because they sat on both sides of the table. So I think the temptation becomes very, very strong when things get really tight and when things go really bad. And let's face it, I mean, that project's distress largely came from COVID. Nobody could have expected it. They had a great track record, a great background. But when the squeeze came, right, the decision was made, and ultimately it was the EB-5 side that was at more of a loss. So again, it's, when everything goes as planned, I could argue for the fully integrated model, but unfortunately, bad things do happen. Unfortunately, economic cycles do create pressures, and you want an advocate for you and your investors, and at least that's our take on it.
I mean, I completely agree on it. I think from an investor's perspective, I do not see necessarily a benefit to an integrated model. That's not to say there have not been great integrated projects. Having the experience on both the developer side and the regional center side can be valuable, but to me, it's a green flag when the regional center is separate from the developer, because the developer's interest is in obtaining financing for their project and finishing their project and kind of making the highest possible profit on that project. Our regional center's interest is in continuing to operate as a regional center to attract more investors into projects in the future so they can manage more EB-5 money. So that aligns their interests more with investors. I want my regional center negotiating with the developer on behalf of their investors. And I do want an entity that kind of gets paid from the return of the money, not just from the money being deployed in the project. So I like a separate model, generally speaking. Again, that's not to say they're not great players who are integrated, but the separation definitely helps to protect the investors a little better.
And I think if you are going to invest in a structure where the NCE and the regional center are affiliated, ask those detailed questions about who's managing the regional side of that business, their history, and actually ask for real paper. What are their compliance and procedures and operational business plan look like?
I'm going to push us along here a little bit. I see we got about 7 minutes, so we're going to kind of lightning round through these last slides and then leave some time for Q&A, and we'll stick around as long as you guys like. But this is kind of a nice segue from the topic on the last slide to where we are on this slide. We talked about conflicts of interest, and Shay, I'll serve that up to you first, kind of as the corporate attorney on this. But what are some of the more detrimental conflicts of interest that you see and get concerned about as you're looking at EB-5 deals?
Yeah, I sometimes chuckle because under RIA, you hear people say, well, under RIA, you got to disclose conflicts of interest. You're like, geez, under usual security laws dating back to, I don't know, 1776, maybe you have to disclose too. But that's just my thought. But so, yeah, you need, as the lawyer, you disclose, right? No one ever got in trouble for disclosing too much. And that's what I tell my clients. It's all about transparency. And so we have seen through the history of the EB-5 program, it's gotten a lot better where individuals, and a lot of times there will be, just because there's a conflict, it doesn't mean it's tragic. There's always, on some of these more integrated structures, the JC and the NC on smaller deals may be affiliated. That's perfect. It's fine. We disclose this. And so, the problem is, especially when you have the service providers involved, you get in a situation where, maybe the immigration attorney shouldn't be, without disclosing to his clients, taking part of a commission on placing capital at a certain regional center or a certain project, right? This is just common sense, right? It leads to bad things, right? And bad decisions and bias. And so, and despite it's a violation of the SEC broker-dealers laws.
That's what I was going to say. I think that's more than a conflict of interest. We're just violating SEC rules. Yeah.
And so look at those conflicts in that section and ask the detailed questions. I mean, going to red flags, this first one, conflicts of interest, this is all about asking the detailed questions. And you can ask them in writing on email. And a good regional center, a good developer is going to have a detailed response. And if they're not going to, if they avoid a detailed response, well, that's a red flag right there.
Mm-hmm. I think it's nice to also ask the attorneys to pick a side. I mean, some conflicts or some dual representation is going to occur. If you're hiring a very senior expert attorney in the EB-5 space, whether it's a securities lawyer, corporate, or immigration attorney, chances are that immigration attorney has done some sort of work, whether it's consulting, templates, or so on, for a lot of the bigger regional centers. So these conflicts, I know certainly they have happened for me when I practice. You know, one day I'm consulting a regional center on something, the matter is closed. A year later, I have an investor who wants to invest in that regional center. So we always disclose the conflict, and we always made it very clear in our retainer who we will end up representing if the conflict, if such conflict arises that it no longer allows us to represent both. So if a conflict arises when the two parties are at odds or their interests may be at odds, we always stated that we will end representing regional center. We will no longer provide legal advice to them and will represent investors. That was our take. I think it's a good thing to ask someone to do that. Again, I would stay away, like what you, Shay, said, tragic conflict of interest. Like, usually I would recommend staying away from ongoing representation of two parties, whether it's a regional center and an investor. Representation that has happened in the past and the project is over and now you're representing a different side, that's usually different because the chances of an actual conflict arising are rare. But one thing that I would want to really mention here, and I'm sure this panel will back me up, be careful if anyone tells you who you should be using. If your project is telling you you have to use one of their immigration attorneys or their in-house counsel, walk away. There's absolutely, you have the right to independent counsel. You have the right to decide who your ongoing representation is. You have the right to switch your attorneys. So look out for those conflicts of interest there. Someone who is taking care of the project should not be telling you who to use as your personal attorney.
Very good point. Very good point. So investment term, I mean, with the new sustainment guidance that came post RIA and that came back in October, we've got this new guidance from the Immigration Service where the kind of investment timeline and immigration processes have been decoupled, right? And so now there's all this talk around the 2 years. Speaking to this real quick, there were a couple things we had talked about of what we've seen in deals. Irina, I might take this first one to you. Day one, understanding day one, both for the time and the interest. Can you speak to that and some of the things investors should look out for?
Absolutely. If you're seeing, well, when you're looking at the term of your investment, whether it's the term of the loan or when you're looking at when the interest rate will be paid, always look at the start date and also conditions, because there are projects who may advertise it's a 2-year loan agreement, but your start date is the end of the construction period, which is obviously going to extend it and make it in reality a 4 or 5 year loan agreement. So look at when is day one of this agreement. And for some projects, it's actually based on each individual coming into the project. So every investor may have a slightly different start date. And same with the interest payments. The interest payments are paid they start accumulating or accruing at what date? And also, what are some of the conditions? What are some of the conditions where this interest may not get paid or there are additional expenses where your interest is going to be used to cover those expenses? So just look out for those two things. And gentlemen, if you want to fill in, but yeah,
just to
I
add
wanted
on to add to the back of that, Irina, you were talking about kind of expenses to be paid out of your interest. Also look at the very back end when it's time for repayment, if certain expenses can be taken from your investment capital, your principal, right? I think this is something to be sensitive to and look out for in the documents.
Absolutely. Mhm. Well, I
I-
will throw out a question there for you, Kyle. We're hearing this 2-year term. How do you feel about it?
So caveating it with what is day one, right? If we're kind of saying day one is, the capital deployed and the capital is being deployed somewhere in this construction process, um, 2 years is really difficult, right? If we go back to what banks typically do, right? We have a term called construction mini perm, right? And it's basically kind of a 3-year loan with kind of 2 1-year extensions. And what they're doing is basically providing time for the construction activity to occur, for some stabilization to occur, because they know that they themselves, as a bank and other banks, require kind of a stabilized asset in order for the refinancing to be a viable path, right? And so that 3+1+1 model is something we see with traditional banks that aren't dealing in the immigration process. If you are talking about a pure 2-year deal and you're investing during this construction period, that is really, really hard to imagine about how that exit's going to happen. What bank is going to refinance in the middle of construction at a decent rate? What bank is going to refinance with no operating history? Right. And so you have to look at those things. And when you look at the documents, if the documents say, well, then we can just kind of extend indefinitely if these options don't happen, well, then it's kind of disingenuous to call it 2 years. The other thing I've seen is, yeah, it's a 2-year term, but you have the sole repayment source of the cash flow of the project. Well, again, that feels a little disingenuous, right? I mean, if you can't reasonably generate that type of cash flow to repay the EB-5 investors in whole, is that really a 2-year deal or not? So I think, there are some unique scenarios and unique projects that might be able to pull that off, but on the whole, I think that's generally a little harder to do on a predictable basis.
Mhm.
Guys,
Yeah,
just
I think that's one of the things I want to mention from the risk analysis perspective. 2 years, shorter periods don't mean a safer project. It doesn't actually mean you're going to get your money back faster. So if you're taking on additional risks in the project itself, the nature of the project, the assets, or if the timeline is just too ambitious, that can literally mean higher risk, and that can mean massive delays in the return of your funds or potential loss. So yes, the immigration requirements have been sort of separated from the immigration timeline, and the investment timeline have been decoupled. It is possible to maybe go through a shorter investment term, but investors should still analyze every single project and every single timeline to understand how realistic it is. Don't go for the tagline that they're going to repay in 2 years.
we have a question in the chat that I think is very relevant here. What is the most common start date for an EB-5 project? I mean, I'll take a crack at it, and you two can tell me if you think I'm off here. But generally in real estate, and this is what's, I think, complicated about EB-5. EB-5 funding is coming in tranches from investors, right? Unless you're kind of doing bond structures, which is, kind of individualized debt, or some of these other things, creating individualized exits can be pretty difficult, right? So if you say the most common exit for EB-5 is a refinance event or sale, those things typically have to happen in kind of a single event, right? That's going to take the whole thing out. So I would say the most common start date for an EB-5 project is usually the last funding of EB-5 dollars. So when kind of all the EB-5 dollars have been deployed, that funding commitment has been met, that kind of starts and sets out day one. But Irina, Shay, do you see something different than that being?
I see both on both extremes. The day one is the first deployment of the first EB-5 tranche of, let's just say, 800,000, or the end, kind of depending on the project.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And both work.
Yeah, I think for if we're going to talk about most, again, maybe it's the types of projects that I look at. I think the vast majority, it's usually when the raise is finished or close to the end, when the EB-5 loan as a whole is closed. But obviously there's it differs, and I'm seeing more projects now, if they're doing a very large raise that they know is going to take about a year, there are different start dates for each individual's loans. So they're doing like tranches to the developer.
Makes sense. Well, with that, guys, I want to thank everybody. I know we've run a little bit over here. Thanks for hanging around with us. Really appreciate the time. I know Irina and Shay have both said they'll stick around. If there are some of you that have additional questions, we'll continue to talk, but we really appreciate everybody taking the time. You know, the focus here was really trying to educate the marketplace, so everybody's asking, you know, smart questions, understanding the risks they're taking. Transparency was a theme of the RIA, and I think continuing to educate the investor markets and the advisors that the investors are working with is a very important step for the stability of EB-5 and the long-term success. So hopefully we did a little bit to help to that end here with this webinar, and we'll hang around and answer more questions.
I think we have some questions that were unanswered.
Yeah, I mean, I
bring them
saw one that was, what is a regional center? And, you know, that's kind of a foundational question, but let's go at it, right? So a regional center is getting a designation from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service to direct investment into a geographic area, right? And so regional centers get approved with a geographic scope, and then that gives the regional center an ability to pool investments from EB-5 investors and direct those into job creating projects. That is in contrast to direct EB-5, which now post RIA, you're using single EB-5 investors that are going into an investment. And a lot of times what you're seeing is either they are the business owner, they're directly involved, and they're meeting the EB-5 requirements through a more active type of role. Now, a distinction that I think is important to lay out is, you know, there are some regional centers out there that kind of get this license or designation from the Immigration Service, and then they're just renting out their regional center to fund managers that are kind of managing in the what's called new commercial enterprise, or the EB-5 partnership, and then deploying those dollars. A lot of times, like in the situation of our group, we have the regional center, and then we're also the manager of that investment vehicle.
Okay. And then there was also a question about purchasing an existing property. What if a project, or can a project purchase an existing real estate property, whether it's vacant or currently is tenant occupied? Is it possible to create enough jobs in those projects?
Yeah, I have a couple of these, and you know, usually they're usually smaller deals, right? It's usually by sponsors bringing over, you know, two of his friends from Mumbai, right, that he's grown up with, and so it's not like a true passive kind of capital raise model. Now, you know, it's USCIS has been pretty clear. The only thing they've been clear about, or only one of the four things they've been clear about over the entirety of the program, is that, you know, a straight up asset purchase just simply won't work, right? Because there's not really any economic effects. You're just replacing ownership essentially at the asset level. However, you know, it does work if, you know, let's say I have a couple clients will do a build out of a restaurant, right? So they're gonna just be the tenant, and then there's actually substantial construction expenditures that will cover 3 or 4 investors, or maybe, you know, 2 or 3 for that build out. Or a lot of times maybe it's a hotel and they're changing flags and they're rehabbing it with real construction economic impacts happening. And I think that's also where, talking about EB-5 teams, where a reliable EB-5 economist will come into play, who has experience with these types of models.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the key there is just significant enough expenditures to create the jobs needed for the EB-5 investment that's being taken in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's definitely been done before, but of course, there's a limitation. You can't count the existing buildings. It's expenditures, and also the money you're spending has to provide value in job creation. So if you already have a tenant occupied building, unless they were really planning to depart that building but for some sort of like remodeling work, it will be very hard to show that their future tenant occupancy jobs were created by you, because they kind of existed beforehand. So a good economist will be very, very important. And this is not where I would get overly creative or push the boundaries, because it will be very hard to argue additional jobs here. And we have definitely seen in EB-5 where a business buys assets of a prior company, and USCIS will make an argument saying, basically, prove to us that you created these jobs and it wasn't the owner of these prior assets that created these jobs, even though the company was closed at the time that the assets were purchased.
And also economic impacts, that opens up a whole new can of worms. We're seeing this with solar farms, or maybe the solar panels are being bought from China. Well, that doesn't count as a EB-5 eligible expenditure. So I don't mean to open up, this to an economic webinar, but I think it's important to keep in mind on certain types of unique businesses where the expenditures are being made.
So
I think it's great to open up a can of worms, but there's a question, Kyle, that I was hoping you can answer. There is a question of why are there more EB-5 debt projects rather than equity?
Good question.
I think that is a product of the foreign markets and ultimately what was sellable for the distribution channel. Understanding equity investments, I think, takes deeper underwriting, getting into those documents, understanding the documents, understanding the partners. So, that can be difficult. Look, we've done a preferred equity deal in the past that was a great deal and really worked well for all the investors, and the outcomes were there. I think there's just been a market perception issue around it. So I think for the more experienced regional center operators, we've just kind of gravitated towards what sells in the market. But I know we are getting the plug pulled on us, everyone. I really appreciate everybody investing the time, hanging around for questions. You have our email addresses here if you want to follow up with further questions. I know my email box is open, and I'm sure Irina and Shay are willing to answer as well. So we thank you again for the time. We thank you for the host, EB-5 Investors, for putting together this great event, and look forward to hopefully seeing you all again soon on the next webinar.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.